The silence was the worst part. It wasn't the silence of deep space. That was a rushing, static-filled roar of radiation and distant energy. This was a manufactured, perfect silence, a vacuum of sound that seemed to pull the light and heat out of the small diplomatic station named Hope. It felt like being sealed inside a glass coffin, watching the rest of the universe stand still. Captain Clarabelle didn't move. She was the picture of control, her spine straight against the worn padding of her negotiation chair. Her eyes, however, betrayed the fear. They were locked on the forward viewport, which was currently filled with the enemy. The Vrakian command vessel, the Dreadnought of Silence, lived up to its name. It wasn't a sleek silver ship like the ones in old Earth movies. It was a monolith, a slab of matte black starship that absorbed all incoming light. It looks less like a vessel designed to travel and more like a great cosmic tombstone placed directly between the orbit of Mars and the pale blue marble of Earth. It had materialized 3 days ago, not with a burst of energy or a ripple in space, but simply there, as if the entire section of the void had been replaced. 3 days of silence had followed the arrival. Now there was just this final quiet broadcast. Clara glanced briefly at her chief linguistic analyst, Ethan Hale. Ethan was hunched over his glowing console, his fingers flying across the virtual keys, trying to make sense of the stream of alien glyphs that pulsed across his secondary screen. He looked young, too young for this. His brow was furrowed with the kind of intense focus that comes from trying to find a mistake in a math problem when your life is the prize. His job was to analyze the Vrakian language for any cultural nuance, any sign of fear or negotiation room. So far, the Vrakian language had translated perfectly into, "You will obey." "They're not even trying to encrypt this, Captain," Ethan muttered, his voice barely audible over the low hum of the life support. "It's a wide-band broadcast. They don't care who listens. It's a declaration, not a discussion." Clara nodded slowly. "They have nothing to hide, Ethan. They expect us to be terrified, not to fight." The Vrakian viewport, which took up almost the entire back wall of the dreadnought, shimmered, and the creature they called the Supreme Imperative Rock appeared. It was enormous. Even on screen, the sheer mass of its obsidian carapace seemed to band the light around it. The creature looked like an armored beetle the size of a large truck, but standing upright on 4 jointed legs. Its head was a dark sphere, dominated by 6 slow-moving, oily black eyes that seemed to look both through and past the small human figures. This was the face of absolute power, the end of history for 1,000 worlds. The sound that came next was not spoken, but synthesized. It was too deep, too perfect to be natural, a baritone that vibrated in the bones of the small diplomatic station. It sounded like granite grinding against granite, a slow, inevitable force of nature. "Terran species designation 39 Delta," the Imperator of Rock began, his voice filling every corner of the room, yet somehow remaining cold. "Your defiance has ended. Your independent existence concludes now." Clara's hand rested on the panic button, not to run but to send the final encrypted message back to Earth's Defense Command. No possible negotiation. Prepare for total engagement. She didn't press it, not yet. She owed them the dignity of listening to the end. The Imperator of Rock continued, detailing the terms of surrender. The words were simple, yet carried the weight of everything the Vrakians had done since they first left their home galaxy. Your planet will become a processing center for raw materials. Your population will be integrated into the collective as a low-tier servant species. You will perform tasks assigned to you by your Vrakian overseers. You will not reproduce without permission. You will not assemble in groups larger than 27. Your religion, your culture, your art, and your governance are hereby rendered irrelevant and are discarded. Each sentence was a hammer blow to humanity's identity. The Vrakians weren't interested in resources or land. They were interested in obedience. They were detailing the end of human self-determination, stripping away everything that made them human and leaving behind only labor. Ethan's breathing became shallow. He kept his eyes on the translation feed, looking for a loophole, a legalistic phrase, anything that suggested this was a performance rather than a decree. He found nothing. The language was as brutal and efficient as the black ship hanging outside. Imperative Rock paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle. The pause was a tactical device. It was the moment where the conquered species realized the depth of their mistake and the hopelessness of their situation. In this pause, they usually wept or begged or launched a futile attack. They broke. Clara felt the immense pressure of that pause. She felt the weight of every lost civilization Vrock had described in the history files they had studied. The Kuthari who offered their children, the souls who burned their own cities, the countless others who simply stopped fighting in this moment of overwhelming dread. The malice pouring from the screen was palpable. It was designed to crush the will before a single shot was fired, a cheaper, faster way to conquest. Imperator Vrock's massive armored body shifted slightly on the screen, a tiny, slow movement that somehow felt more threatening than any grand gesture. The 6 eyes seemed to blink in unison, an act of alien patience. He was waiting for the plea. He was waiting for the fear. He was waiting for the pure, overwhelming dread. Imperator Vrock waited. The silence that followed his final word, discarded, was thick and heavy. It was a silence filled with expectation, a vast alien patience. Vrock did not believe in rushing the moment of surrender. He knew the psychology of a new species facing its doom. They needed a minute to feel the cold final weight of everything they were about to lose. They needed to know despair. Clarabelle's jaw was tight, her knuckles white where she gripped the armrests of her chair. She was ready to press the panic button, ready to signal the hopeless final fight. But still, she held the pose of a diplomat, meeting the gaze of the 6 oily eyes on the screen. Ethan Hales swallowed hard. His heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He couldn't look away from the Imperator. He felt the fear like a physical chill. This is it, he thought. This is how it ends. Then the floor of the Hope Station began to vibrate. It was not a violent shake, but a very low, profound shudder, the kind of tremor that suggests something unimaginably large is moving very slowly. The station's lights dimmed a fraction, and a low, distant hum began to build. "What is that?" Clara whispered, leaning forward. Ethan checked his console. "It's coming from the dreadnought, a projected field. My sensors are calling it a sonic wave, subsonic. It's too low for human ears to register as sound, but it's hitting the station hull." The feeling was deeply unsettling. It went bypast the ears and straight to the gut, a feeling of pure, instinctive dread. It felt like the ground was dissolving beneath them, like the laws of physics themselves were being undone. Imperator Vrock, still majestic and still, was deploying the draining resonance, the final step in their psychological conquest. This was the frequency that triggered an ancient, paralyzing fear response in the brain of almost all life forms the Vrackians had met. It was the sound of a planet splitting, of a sun dying, translated into a single, overwhelming frequency. Ethan, a specialist in auditory data, stared at the frequency analysis on his screen. The wave was massive, dense, and perfectly tuned. His console, however, was also performing a cultural translation, trying to process the subsonic input through filters designed for human perception. It was translating a signal of cosmic collapse into something an ordinary human brain could understand. As the energy of the wave peaked, the diplomatic station's sound system, designed to mimic a natural atmosphere for comfort, struggled to turn the deep vibration into an audible wave. The sound that finally broke the silence was not the cry of a dying star. It was a deep, guttural, resonant thwomp. It was wet, drawn out, and ended in a slightly rattling, vibrating release of air. It was, unmistakably, the amplified, exaggerated sound effect of flatulence, the kind of noise used in children's cartoons to signify immediate, over-the-top comedy. Ethan Hale froze. His blood had been running cold with terror a moment ago. Now, a different kind of pressure was building in his chest, a bubble of disbelief and pure, uncontrolled physical absurdity. He looked at his console again. The waveform was still massive and terrifying, a graph of cosmic dread. But the sound being produced by the station's speakers was an absolute, hilarious failure.
It was the sound of a very large, very solemn creature having a tremendous, embarrassing moment in a quiet room. Imperator Vrak remained motionless, waiting for the humans to crumble under the weight of the draining resonance. He was unaware that his ultimate weapon had just sounded exactly like a whoopee cushion the size of a mountain. Ethan lost the battle first. He felt the air catch in his throat, trying to turn a gasp of terror into something else. It came out as a sharp, choked snort, a sudden, high-pitched "ha." The sound was tiny, yet it echoed in the perfect, manufactured silence of the bridge. Clarabelle heard it. She snapped her eyes from the Imperator to Ethan, expecting to see a man in panic. Instead, she saw his shoulders start to shake, his face turning an alarming shade of red as he desperately fought against a rising wave of hysteria. Then, Clara heard the thwump again. The sound system repeated the draining resonance, this time slightly louder, richer, and wetter. It was a truly magnificent sound of digestive failure. The professional ice that Captain Bell had maintained for 3 days cracked. Her mind instantly, traitorously, flashed back to a silly memory of her younger brother using a sound app at a family dinner. The sound was identical. A tiny involuntary tremor ran through her body. She pressed her fist to her mouth, not to mute a scream, but to muffle the terrible, silent laughter that was bubbling up from deep within her stomach. Her eyes, still fixed on the Imperator, were now wide, not with fear, but with a terrifying, professional struggle. Vrak, seeing the two small human figures shaking and silent, interpreted the reaction perfectly. They were frozen with fear. Their bodies were locked in paralytic shock, their vocal cords unable to form words. The draining resonance was a success, just as it had been on the 1,000 worlds before. He maintained the resonance field, letting the sound, the deep, resonant, embarrassing thwump, continue to wash over them, ensuring the terror was complete. Ethan was now silently crying with the effort of holding the laughter in. Tears of suppressed mirth tracked paths down his cheeks. Every time the massive alien on the screen held its posture of cosmic menace, the sheer contrast with the sound effect being deployed made the situation funnier. He risked a peek at Clara. Her face was contorted, her shoulders heaving, and she looked like she might explode. On the other side of the screen, Imperator Vrak waited, content in the knowledge that he had successfully broken the spirit of another species. He was the harbinger of true dread. He waited for the inevitable silent signal of surrender. But on the Hope Station, the human diplomatic mission was not surrendering. They were merely trying not to laugh themselves to death. The thwump repeated again, a slow, majestic sound of pure, unadulterated comic relief.
Imperative Rock watched the human delegation on his screen. The small, fragile figures were motionless, save for the strange internal quivering. The Imperator interpreted this as a successful paramesis of the primitive Terran nervous system. It was the deepest form of fear, where the body locks down, unable to run or fight. Excellent. This species was even weaker than he had calculated. They were perhaps too primitive to even scream. The thum sound, the draining resonance, faded slightly, leaving another period of silence. Vrak held his imposing pose, his 6 eyes perfectly still. He decided that a full, agonizing minute of silence was necessary to seal the psychological collapse. He was a master of terror, a connoisseur of conquest. But the silence was interrupted. On the Hope Station, Ethan Hale made a tiny, high-pitched noise, a sound that was half choked off sneeze, half snicker. He quickly bent over his console, pretending to adjust a control, but his whole body was now convulsing silently. He felt lightheaded, the air thin from holding in so much frantic energy. Clarabelle's hand was still clamped over her mouth, but it was not enough. Her eyes were squeezed shut, and a single silent tear, a tear of pure, painful mirth, escaped and tracked down her cheek. She could see the enormous, serious obsidian alien on the screen, waiting patiently for their surrender, completely unaware that his ultimate weapon sounded like an oversized novelty cushion. The humor of the situation was a physical pressure, a painful joy that demanded release. Vrak, seeing the shaking intensify, decided the job was not fully done. He had encountered species that required a double tap of dread to finalize their submission. This was typical of highly primitive, resilient life forms. A final, overwhelming shove was needed to break their spirit entirely. With a slow, deliberate movement that spoke of monumental power, Vrock signaled his ship. "The Terran resistance is negligible," Vrock stated, his synthesized voice now carrying a note of smug, cold certainty. "To ensure complete compliance and save the collective the cost of a full tactical deployment, we will now finalize the draining resonance sequence." Ethan's eyes snapped open at the translation. Finalize? The floor of the Hope Station began to vibrate again, but this time it was deeper, faster, and more violent. The low hum built rapidly into an oppressive, throbbing wave that seemed to be actively squeezing the air out of the room. The lights on the bridge flashed, strained by the energy deployment. And then came the sound. The system on the Hope struggled to process the boosted frequency, resulting in an auditory event that was louder, lower, and incredibly more pronounced than the first one. It was a massive, rich, echoing whoomp-thud rattle. It had the distinct, awful finality of the punchline. Clara lost it completely. The dignified professional demeanor she had carefully maintained for years dissolved in a single high-pitched giggle that managed to escape around her tightly clenched fist. It was a sound of pure, helpless joy, the sound of someone completely defeated by absurdity. But the Vrockians were not done. They were adding the visual element. Outside the main viewport, coiling out from a massive, almost invisible gun port on the dreadnought of Silence, a shimmering field of energy began to form. It was intended to look like a nexus of dark matter, a swirling vortex of doom designed to suggest that the ship was preparing to fire a weapon that could erase continents. The color was a deep, unsettling indigo, and it twisted and flowed like black oil in water. Ethan looked up from his console just as the boosted, wet voom hit the room again, perfectly timed with the visual display of the indigo coiling, swirling vortex of doom. To his human brain, the combination was too much. The sound, the dramatic purple-black light show, the solemnity of the giant alien, it all clicked into the most perfect, over-the-top cartoon villain's introductory scene he had ever witnessed. It was a visual and acoustic parody of evil. Ethan threw his head back and let out a bark of laughter, loud, muffled, and entirely uncontrolled. It wasn't a snicker this time. It was a noise of utter physical relief and hysteria. He slammed his forearm down on his console, doubling over as his shoulders shook. The entire bridge crew, who had been listening silently in the background, now erupted in a wave of muffled sounds. A grunt of laughter from the comms officer, a snorting sound from the engineering liaison. The collective energy of the suppressed fear was breaking into a chaotic wave of suppressed comedy. The entire human diplomatic presence was actively, violently fighting off a fit of the giggles in the face of planetary annihilation. Imperator Vrock saw the violent shaking, the strange contorted faces, and the sudden, sharp, unnatural noises. This was not paralytic fear. This was something new. This was defiance. This was contempt. No species in Vrockian history had ever treated the draining resonance with anything but terror. To laugh, to make these strange, gasping noises in the face of absolute conquest, was the ultimate insult, an act of such profound disrespect that it bordered on biological madness. The Imperator's massive obsidian head tilted, the 6 eyes focusing on the small, shaking figures. The smooth, synthetic baritone of his voice cracked, replaced by a low, furious rumble that was almost animalistic. "Insolence," Vrock transmitted, the word now sharp and hot, filled with real, personal anger. "Your species is too ignorant for immediate servitude. You are a cancer of disrespect." The draining resonance cut out abruptly. The air in the Hope Station suddenly felt quiet, breathable, and cold again. The lights flashed off. The only sound was the humans still trying to regain control of their lungs. Vrock's final words of this address were slow, deliberate, and delivered with the weight of true, terrible fury. "You will not be rendered irrelevant. You will be rendered agonizing. Your termination will be swift, but the pain will be total. You have earned a very, very slow end." The view screen went blank. The connection was cut. The massive black shape of the dreadnought of Silence remained silent and still, no longer intimidating us with sound, but with the promise of utter, righteous destruction. Clara finally managed to breathe, pulling her fist away from her mouth. Her face was flushed, her hair slightly messy.
She looked across the bridge at Ethan, who was propped up on his console, wiping tears from his eyes. Their eyes met, and a final shared wave of breathless giggling washed over them both. They had just been promised an agonizing end, and their first reaction was to chuckle about it.
The silence that followed the Vrakian sign-off was a dizzying change from the cosmic sound effect in the Imperial rage. On the bridge of the Hope Station, the air was thick with the smell of ozone and the nervous energy of people who had just cheated death through sheer accident of acoustics. Captain Clarabelle took a deep, shaky breath, pushing herself upright. Her face was still hot, and her eyes were shining with the residue of tears. Across the console, Ethan Hale was slumped forward, his head resting on his arms, making small, exhausted choking noises. "Ethan!" Clara said, her voice raspy. She had to clear her throat and try again. "Ethan, status report, now. We have maybe 30 minutes before total agony starts." Ethan lifted his head, his eyes were bloodshot, but the hysteria was gone, replaced by a sudden, urgent focus. Right. The draining resonance. They're going to fire. We have to do something." Clara stood up and moved quickly to his station. The rest of the bridge crew, who had been in various states of silent collapse, snapped back to attention, wiping their own faces and quickly settling into their chairs. The joke was over. Survival was the only priority now. "The draining resonance isn't a weapon," Ethan said, pointing at the still flickering frequency graph. "It's a psychological tool. It's meant to cause an ancient, deep-seated fear response. It works on low-frequency waves below 20 Hz that hit the gut and the inner ear, triggering panic." Clara frowned, looking at the graph. "But the sound we heard, the thump." "That was our fault," Ethan explained quickly, his fingers flying across the console to pull up the system diagnostics. "Our environmental system here on the Hope is designed to add low-level background noise to make the silence of space less stressful for humans. It's supposed to normalize all incoming sound waves to the 20 to 20,000 Hz range, the standard human hearing range. When that massive, perfect subsonic wave hit, the system processed it, compressed it, and spat it out as an audible sound." He paused, shaking his head slightly in disbelief. "The result, Captain, is that the perfect sound of cosmic dread, the sound of a planet splitting, was converted into a massive low-frequency pressure wave, and for the human brain, that frequency, that specific tonal envelope, is culturally and biologically linked to comic sound effects." Ethan tapped a region on the graph. "I've labeled it the comic sonic zone. They were trying to induce terror, and we heard a whoopee cushion the size of a mountain. It's an acoustic failure of profound proportions." Clara leaned back, running her hand through her short hair. "So their ultimate weapon of terror is a giant joke to us, and they just promised us total agony because they think we were laughing at them on purpose?" "Exactly," Ethan confirmed. "They think we're unbelievably arrogant. They think we're defying them with organized contempt. They took the laughter as an act of war." "Then we have to tell them the truth," Clara decided instantly. "We have to explain the mistake. We have to prove that our laughter was not defiance, but an unfortunate biological and technical failure." Ethan looked worried. "Captain, how do you politely tell a being that just promised you agony that their weapon sounds like a bad joke?" "Carefully," Clara said. "We don't have time for complex diplomacy. Prepare a new broadcast. Send them the raw frequency data and a full scientific report on the sound conversion. No emotions, just facts. I will deliver the message." Ethan worked with blinding speed, compiling a massive data packet of acoustic science, human auditory biology, and an attached note carefully detailing the Hope's sound normalization protocols. He avoided using any loaded words like funny or joke. Instead, he described the converted sound as an involuntary auditory signal of low-frequency digestive distress, culturally associated with light-hearted social humor. When the data packet was ready, Clara returned to her chair. The tension was back, but now it was a focused, nervous energy, not paralyzing fear. She looked at the blank view screen where the Imperator had stood. "Verkakian dreadnought of silence. This is Captain Clarabelle of the Terran diplomatic vessel Hope. We request re-establishment of the direct communication channel. We have urgent, factual data concerning the draining resonance sequence." The waiting was almost worse than the screaming. 10 seconds passed, 20, 30. Then the screen flickered, and Imperator Vrock reappeared. He was not roaring or trembling. He was simply still. Every one of his 6 eyes was fixed on Clara. The only emotion visible was an icy, focused contempt. He was waiting for her to beg, or perhaps to offer a final futile threat. Clara kept her hands visible and her tone steady. Imperator Vrock, the response you registered from our species was not an act of defiance, contempt, or insolence. It was an unavoidable mistake of physics and biology. We regret the offense taken, but it was purely accidental. She paused, letting the translation system catch up. Vrock remained still. We have transmitted a detailed report to your systems of ship. This report shows that the frequency you deployed, the draining resonance, was highly effective on a pure energy level. However, when processed by our small station's environmental sound systems, that frequency was forcibly shifted into a zone of human audible sound. She took another steadying breath, preparing for the most awkward sentence in the history of galactic diplomacy. Imperator, she said, her voice completely neutral. For the Terran species, that specific auditory signal, the deep, resonating wave of pure energy, is translated by our brain's filters into a sound that is universally associated with light, involuntary digestive distress, a signal, in our culture, that is a source of harmless, everyday humor. The massive obsidian head of Imperator Vrock tilted, a slow, unnatural motion. The icy contempt began to melt, replaced by a deep, profound, and utterly silent confusion. He had been insulted by a digestive noise. The concept was so alien, so absurd, that his 1,000 years of conquest and terror had given him no tools to deal with it.
Imperator Vrock did not respond immediately. The massive obsidian head remained tilted, motionless, its 6 eyes fixed on the small human figures. The communication channel was technically open, but a silence greater than the void itself descended on the bridge of the Hope Station. It was the silence of a computer that had just been handed a problem with no logical solution, a cosmic paradox wrapped in a bad joke. Clarabelle waited, holding her breath. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours. Her calm demeanor was stretched thin, but she knew that any sign of agitation now would ruin the fragile moment. She had delivered the truth. Now the ancient, terrifying mind of the Imperator had to process the idea that its most powerful weapon was a funny noise to another species. On the massive Rockian dreadnought, the Imperator's internal processing units churned through the human data packet. The raw acoustics confirmed the human analysis. The draining resonance, the signature frequency of existential horror, did in fact overlap perfectly with the Terran social humor signature 1A, a sound culturally associated with light, embarrassing bodily functions. The Imperator was not enraged. Rage was an easy emotion, a known quantity. What Vrock felt now was a deep, systemic dread far worse than simple anger. Fear was the foundation of the Rackian Empire. All their conquests, all their laws, and all their social structure relied on the absolute predictability of fear. When the Vrockian ships appeared, species trembled, they surrendered, and they obeyed. It was the natural order of things. But this species, this Terran species, did not fear the sound of annihilation. They giggled. They found the death of their planet to be a source of physical, uncontrollable mirth. If the sound of planetary dread caused only digestive humor, what then truly could terrify them? Finally, the Imperator Vrock moved. It was a slow, mechanical rotation of his entire upper body. The 6 eyes settled, and the deep, synthesized voice returned. It was stripped of its previous fury, and was now low, measured, and dangerously confused. "Captain Bell," Vrock transmitted, "the concept of an involuntary digestive signal being linked to social humor is not computable within our collective logic systems. Your species finds the suggestion of biological failure amusing." Clara nodded slowly. "Sometimes, Imperator, it is a complex cultural signifier, but yes, it is often a source of great amusement." "And your laughter," Vrock continued, the word coming out as if it were coated in sand. The sound you produced, that was not calculated defiance, but a physical failure of your own suppression mechanism. That is correct, Clara confirmed. Our biology demands a release for that type of sudden, absurd tension. The release is laughter. Vrak fell silent again. Ethan, who had been sitting rigidly, risked a glance at Clara. He mouthed, "Play the clip." Clara gave a tiny shake of her head. Not yet. Vrak's voice returned, carrying the weight of a monumental cultural crisis. The basis of the Vrakian Empire is the control of panic. We eliminate resistance through the certainty of consequence. If your species' primary response to total consequence is uncontrolled laughter, then the established framework for Terran integration is fundamentally flawed. The Imperator was not seeing defiance. He was seeing chaos. The Vrakians could handle a fierce military defense. They could destroy ships and fortresses. They could not, however, fight a species that found the sound of their annihilation funny. It was a failure of physics, a failure of culture, and a failure of Vrakian philosophy. "We request a live demonstration," Vrak stated, without a trace of demand, only deep, urgent curiosity. "We require context for this humor. Transmit the social humor signature 1A in isolation and explain its purpose." Ethan immediately opened a small audio file on his console. This was the moment. He composed a brief text overlay for the Vrakians. "Imperator," Clara announced, "we will comply. The purpose of this sound is generally to surprise, to acknowledge the fragility of life, and to briefly disrupt social formality. It is not intended to insult the listener, but to relieve the pressure of the moment." Ethan hit play. A single, clean, perfectly rendered thump sounded through the channel, stripped of the distortion and static of the draining resonance field. The effect on the bridge of the Hope Station was immediate. Several crew members flinched, then quickly covered their mouths, their eyes darting nervously. It was still absurd. On the screen, the Imperative Vrak did not flinch. He did not move. He simply listened to the full, profound, ridiculous sound. Then he listened to it a second time. After the third repetition, Vrak finally spoke. "This does not compute as fear. It computes as biological inefficiency. Why does biological inefficiency elicit mirth?" Clara smiled, a small, tired, but genuine human smile. "That, Imperator, is the part that is entirely unique to us. We do not have an answer that will fit into a data packet. It is simply how we survive." Vrak's head rotated back to its central position. The six eyes seemed to pull away from the humans and look inward, reflecting on a profound, disturbing truth. The threat of annihilation was neutralized not by a weapon, but a cultural reflex the Vrakians could not understand. "The Terran invasion mandate is hereby suspended," Vrak declared. The statement was calm, but the word suspended was seismic. "Immediate conquest is impossible until a full scientific and cultural evaluation of the Terran species' auditory and psychological profile can be established. Your species is not weak, Terrans. You are unpredictable, and unpredictability is the highest threat to the collective." Vrak paused and then issued an entirely new command, one that would redefine the course of human-alien relations forever. "The Dreadnought of Silence will initiate FTL jump in 100 standard Terran minutes. In the interim, you will transmit to our databanks all available media files categorized under comedy, slapstick, and, specifically, auditory humor. This is not a request. It is a mandatory cultural assessment requirement for the Vrakian collective's survival. Your existence now depends on our ability to understand why you did not break." The screen finally went blank. The dark slab of the Dreadnought of Silence remained motionless for exactly 100 minutes. Clara and Ethan sat in stunned silence for a moment, then looked at each other and simultaneously collapsed in a mixture of relief and bewildered laughter. They had saved their planet by making the most powerful creature in the galaxy sit down and study Earth's stockpile of silly sound effects. As the massive Rockian ship finally shimmered and vanished into the darkness of space, leaving the small Hope Station intact and unharmed, Ethan leaned back in his chair, already compiling the mandatory file transfer. "Captain," he said, wiping the last vestiges of tears from his eyes, "I think we just became the cultural exchange department for the entire Rockian Empire. Where do we start?" Clara looked at the monitor displaying the transmission queue, already filling up with requests for old comedy albums and cartoon compilations. "Start with the classics, Ethan," she said, managing a final, exhausted chuckle. "We need to show them how deep the rabbit hole goes."